Stalingrad, winter 1942. What was once a bustling industrial Soviet city on the banks of the Volga River was transformed into a graveyard of rubble, frozen corpses, and ash. Before the siege, children played among trams, mothers baked black bread in workers' kitchens, and cats roamed freely among the cobblestone streets. But everything changed when the Luftwaffe reduced entire neighborhoods to dust. Civilians weren't evacuated. They became trench builders, ammunition carriers, and ultimately victims. Soviet soldiers turned deadly snipers hunted among the ruins. Orphaned children of the 13th Regiment, unable to carry a rifle, defended houses to the death. On the German side, the men of the 6th Army rotted from cold and hunger, trapped without supplies, eating rats, leather, and in the worst cases, human remains. Pavlov and his men held out for more than 60 days in a ruined house. Paulus, Schmidt, and Seidlitz Kurzbach sealed their fate with a surrender that sparked hatred among their peers. When fate catches up with us, life in Stalingrad, months before the attack. Stalingrad, located on the banks of the Volga River, was one of the most important industrial cities in the Soviet Union in 1942. With an estimated population of over 600,000 before the siege, it played a key role in the production of heavy machinery, particularly in the tank and tractor industry, with factories such as the Stalingrad tractor plant and the Red October metallurgical plant. The city was not named after the absolute leader of the Soviet Union by chance, but because it was a symbol of Soviet industrial power and the urban model promoted by communist planning. The main streets were lined with standardized concrete buildings, while working-class neighborhoods extended toward the banks of the Volga. Public transportation, based on trams and buses, operated regularly, and local markets offered basic goods in limited but constant quantities through the state distribution system. Daily life, however, was not easy, even before the start of the war. Shortages of consumer goods were a common reality in many Soviet cities. Technology was advancing, driven by the needs of war and population control, but issues related to the quality of life of the civilian population were quite backward, and many parts of the city lacked accessible sewage systems or other sanitary measures that were already basic in Europe. In Stalingrad, the population adapted to a life of sacrifice, with long lines for bread, recurring problems with the supply of heating during the winters, and constant political surveillance exercised by the state apparatus. Even so, the city maintained an active social and cultural life. Cinemas, schools, libraries, and theaters that offered shows aligned with the party's ideology. With the outbreak of war in June 1941, following the start of Operation Barbarossa, the perception of danger slowly grew. Some of the communist propaganda worked, and the civilian population did not believe that the Germans could easily enter urban areas. However, local authorities began to implement civil defense measures. Air raid drills were organized, anti-tank ditches were dug on the urban periphery, and popular militias were formed with workers and students. At the same time, factories intensified their production, retooling assembly lines to meet the needs of the front. This began to alert the general population, who no longer saw the concrete buildings. At home, many families were separated. Men of military age were mobilized into the Red Army, and some skilled workers were sent to other regions to bolster war production, especially of tanks and weapons. Women took on a central role in industrial work, while adolescents were called upon to assist in auxiliary tasks such as anti-aircraft surveillance, messenger services, and first aid. In the months before the German attack, the city began to experience a steady flow of refugees from the west fleeing the enemy advance. This massive influx overwhelmed available resources. Hospitals became saturated, housing was shared among multiple families, and food became more acutely scarce. In July 1942, the advance of the German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus began to approach the city of Stalingrad dangerously. By this time, Stalin's strategy seemed doomed, and he was unable to stem the advance of the more than 2 million Wehrmacht soldiers marching eastward. The Luftwaffe intensified its reconnaissance missions, a clear sign that the city would become a direct target. However, the evacuation of the civilian population was delayed and limited, as priority was given to the extraction of key machinery and technical personnel, which came at a great political and moral cost to the Red Army. Thousands of civilians, mostly women, the elderly and children, were trapped in the city by choice or due to the logistical impossibility of fleeing. On August 23, 1942, Stalingrad was subjected to a massive aerial bombardment that marked the beginning of the siege. In a single day, more than 40,000 people died, and a large part of the city was reduced to burning rubble. Food stores were destroyed, railway lines cut, and hospitals bombed without distinction. From that moment on, Stalingrad ceased to function as a city. It became an urban battlefield, a tangle of ruins where every square meter would be fought over with blood and fire. The civilian population, already exhausted by the previous months of deprivation, would now face the most brutal siege in modern history. Stalingrad, open city, the capture of the Soviet industrial city by the Germans. After the initial chaos, the authorities began a mass evacuation of civilians across the Volga River, which continued until mid-September. Even then, women, children, and the elderly suffered worse fates than other groups of citizens deemed more useful by the state, such as wounded soldiers and men of draft age, engineers and other specialists, and especially Communist Party officials or leaders. Although municipal administrators later attempted to give the impression of a well-organized and planned evacuation, eyewitness accounts presented a different picture of the exodus. For most Soviet people, it was chaotic and terribly costly in human lives. The crossings and bridges were constantly bombed and machine-gunned by Luftwaffe pilots. Soviet soldiers arriving from the other side of the river encountered a harrowing sight. Crowds of desperate people gathered on the ferries amid piles of belongings, corpses in the water and on the shore, children screaming and crying, searching for their parents, men saying goodbye to their families or in a state of complete shock. However, leaving Stalingrad was only half the odyssey. At first, there were no reception centers on the other bank, and people were simply left lying on the sand at the mercy of the enemy or abandoned to their fate. The sight of hungry, disoriented children begging for bread worried the soldiers heading for the burning city. The situation improved somewhat when the authorities became aware of the situation. After witnessing or hearing the harrowing stories of the crossing and the uncertainty that awaited them beyond the Volga, many Stalingrad residents decided not to leave the city. Women with many children, or those caring for sick relatives, feared leaving their homes, especially with the arrival of winter. Older residents often succumbed to fatalistic indifference, while others dismissed reports of German atrocities as exaggerated. Faced with the possibility of dying during or after the crossing or of resisting the battle in the city, many opted for the latter. There were 3 other routes out of Stalingrad, almost as lethal as the river crossing. The southern route led to unoccupied areas where resources were non-existent and only thugs or would-be collaborators of the Germans remained. The roads leading north and west led directly to the enemy. However, the outbreak of street fighting within the city blocked these exits. By mid-September, Stalingrad had become a vast no-man's land, lined with trenches or machine gun nests in abandoned buildings and smoking ruins. A month later, 6 of the 7 districts were fully or partially occupied by the Germans. The remaining residents moved into the city's sewers and cellars, whose main inhabitants until then had been rats and other vermin. They were now totally at the mercy of the warring armies, with whom they frequently shared their living space, troops on the upper floors, civilians in the basements. Both sides sometimes used them for domestic tasks, such as cooking, washing, and caring for the wounded. Those living directly on the front line or in adjacent territory often had to find new shelter, moving from one place to another with their few belongings. In the dire straits of the ruins of Stalingrad, deprived of essential supplies, the civilian population had to quickly adapt to the persistent hostility of their new environment. Families banded together to ensure each other's survival, changing their eating habits from day to night and dressing to make themselves less visible among the ruins. Young women and girls tried to deceive their armed neighbors or soldiers from both sides by shaving their heads and feigning contagious illnesses. Children in Stalingrad recall being forced to wear several layers of thick clothing, even on the hottest days, to protect them from external dangers. Bartering, scavenging, and grave robbing were common ways to obtain clothing, although some considered it irreverent to undress the corpses littering the streets and buildings of the burned city. Although finding sturdy shelter and adequate clothing was a difficult task in itself, obtaining food and, above all, water often became an extremely dangerous venture. Thirst, according to those who remained in Stalingrad, was much harder to bear than hunger, but obtaining water entailed grave risks and could prove lethal. With the water supply system destroyed, residents took it from wells, springs, or directly from the Volga. Sometimes it was necessary to wade several kilometers under shelling to the nearest water source, which was often contaminated with machine oil, blood, or corpses. Obtaining food could prove just as deadly. Food supplies in Stalingrad had been difficult before the start of the battle due to the growing number of refugees from the city's outskirts. The evacuation of grain, flour, and livestock further depleted the reserves, and marauding mobs carried off much of what remained after the bombing raids in late August. Now, everything edible was considered fit for consumption. Herbs, berries, small rodents, leather goods, starch glue, even clay and river silt. Families living in combat zones organized foraging parties, sometimes for days on end. Not everyone made it back. Grain was the most important food source. It was dug up from sunken barges, scavenged from the wreckage of train cars, or stolen from the grain elevator, which finally fell into German hands in late September. Starving civilians risked their lives to obtain some of its contents. The main thieves were children, who were a less likely target due to their small size and agility. Both armies observed an incredible number of young people wandering the streets of Stalingrad. Foraging and begging were their primary concerns. Because of their young age, they often performed these traditionally adult roles better than their elders, especially when it came to forming relationships with soldiers. They tended to arouse less suspicion and the pity of men who still remembered their sons or younger brothers. The young men made their way, under heavy bombardment, to the Red Army's field kitchens where they could obtain food. Sometimes enemy soldiers also took pity on the young beggars, though just as often they amused themselves by frightening the children with guns and shouts, or by throwing tidbits at them and laughing as they argued on the ground. As the battle dragged on, the enemy began to compete with the civilian population for food and clothing. At times, they literally fought with women and children for provisions or blankets. Witnesses described the enemy soldiers as savages who took whatever they found. That said, altercations with Soviet soldiers were not uncommon, whether over food or mistrust. Neither side could resist considering civilians as useful resources. Soon they were employed as saboteurs, spies, messengers, or auxiliaries, helping to clear the area of rotting corpses or fetching water from the river. Whether under duress, of their own volition, or out of necessity, non-combatants exposed themselves to great danger, as soldiers on both sides were ordered to shoot anyone who crossed the front line. Fear of saboteurs and spies was one of the reasons why, in mid-October, the Germans and Soviets began a mass evacuation of civilians from their areas of operations. After occupying most of Stalingrad, the Germans found themselves in charge of 250,000 local residents who were to be removed from the combat zone. What followed perfectly in line with Hitler's previous orders to depopulate Stalingrad through deportation and murder. The operation quickly turned brutal and caused profound suffering. Every day, up to 10,000 Stalingrad residents were marched westward from the city, where they were abandoned to their fate, herded into camps without provisions, or forcibly recruited for forced labor. Some managed to escape and return to the city. By the end of the year, no more than 15,000 civilians remained in the German-occupied Stalingrad area. Non-combatants also represented an obstacle for the Soviet forces. Those who remained in the city hampered military operations, as they wandered among the rubble in search of food and could be used by the enemy to gather intelligence. To minimize risks, the army received orders to detain and evacuate all civilians from the area. Not all were left alone. Fearful of what awaited them on the desolate east bank of the Volga, they begged the troops to leave them alone. Some had to be marched to the ferry with an armed escort. However, the army's efforts were only partially effective. While many were evacuated, some never crossed the river and ended up living in the dugouts dotting the west bank. Others made themselves useful. Those who knew Stalingrad well, especially its sewage system, and could serve as guides, were considered particularly valuable. However, even though Soviet civil society had adapted to these inhuman living conditions, resources were dwindling daily. Winter was coming, and the worst was yet to come. The gaze into the abyss, inhumane conditions, animal consumption and cannibalism during the Battle of Stalingrad. By the end of 1942, the supply chain had completely collapsed. Food reserves, already limited before the attack, were largely destroyed by the initial bombing. Municipal warehouses, bakeries, and distribution centers were hit by German bombs or fell under the control of Wehrmacht units advancing on the city. The first signs of the food crisis appeared a few weeks after the siege began, when military rations were given primarily to Red Army units, while civilians had to survive on whatever they could find: roots, tree bark, charred remains of food, or hazardous waste among the ruins. Many began raising pigeons, rats, or dogs as an alternative source of protein. There were recorded cases of people boiling leather from belts, shoes, and suitcases in an attempt to extract some sustenance from what was inedible. Another common food was potato peel or onion skin soup, which was rationed among hidden families. But by November, domestic animals, many of them abandoned or stray, began to progressively disappear. Cats, initially respected for their ability to control rats, were eventually hunted, as were dogs and wild birds. Around some shelters, boiled bones, remains cooked over fires, and skins hung to dry were found. Soviet documentary sources and military medical reports confirm the emergence of cases of severe starvation, scurvy, and gastrointestinal illnesses caused by the consumption of contaminated or unsafe food. As winter approached, hunger reached extreme proportions. The Volga River, which served as a supply route for the Soviet garrison on the other side of the city, froze in November 1942, making transportation even more difficult. Rafts bringing in ammunition and evacuating the wounded were constant targets of German artillery. Under these conditions, the chances of getting food to civilians were practically nil. In this context, desperate behavior emerged. Looting corpses became a common practice, not only to obtain clothing or belongings, but also to take advantage of any food scraps found among their clothes or backpacks. Reports from the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, documented arrests of individuals accused of desecrating corpses for food. Cannibalism, although officially denied during the conflict, was later confirmed in declassified documents and witness accounts. Isolated cases were reported in basements where several families lived together, in makeshift hospitals without supplies, or among abandoned, orphaned children. The Soviet Penal Code provided for the death penalty for those engaging in this practice, but in many cases the authorities turned a blind eye to a reality that overwhelmed all control. At the same time, the social structure began to break down. The initial solidarity eroded as the weeks passed. Family ties, moral norms, and collective structures weakened in the face of the instinct for survival. Some civilians handed over their last provisions to soldiers in combat, others organized into small groups to share what little they had. But there were also those who hid food, betrayed neighbors, or let the weakest die to prolong their own lives. The natural and social ecosystem that used to regulate itself collapsed. There were no more cats or dogs because they had been turned into soup, so more elusive animals like rats and mice became, along with the Nazis, another enemy. Aside from the diseases they could transmit to the city's inhabitants, which was their least concern at that point, the mice could eat the little grain left or any other food, making them a small natural force of protection. On this point, there is a story that is both legend and reality. The supply corridor was controlled by the Red Army, whose main objective was to retain the city, and some historians claim that the state sanitary service found a way to fill a train with Siberian cats which were sent towards Stalingrad. The objective was clear: to eliminate the rodents which reproduced rapidly, feeding on the frozen corpses in the streets and the scarce food available to the population and troops. The cats quickly brought the rodent population under control, allowing the population, along with the expulsion of the Nazis, to gradually rebuild their lives and the city. Nevertheless, the winter of 1942 to 1943 was one of the harshest in living memory. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, and the lack of firewood, electricity, or fuel caused thousands of people to die of exposure in their shelters. Respiratory diseases such as pneumonia and bronchitis spread unchecked. Hospitals, lacking medicine and staff, were limited to providing shelter and comfort. Many doctors and nurses died alongside their patients. Despite everything, the city did not surrender. The Soviet resistance, supported by reinforcements crossing the Volga each night, continued to defend itself meter by meter. And civilians, though invisible to many military accounts, were an active part of that resistance. They cooked, dug trenches, built fortifications with bricks extracted from the rubble, cared for the wounded, or simply survived. Their silent resistance was as decisive as that of the soldiers wielding rifles. The siege of Stalingrad was not only a military battle, it was also a struggle for human dignity in the face of the collapse of all forms of civilization. Little big heroes, the child soldiers of the 13th Soviet Regiment. In the defense of Stalingrad, the line separating childhood from adulthood quickly blurred. With the city under siege and the civil structure in ruins, thousands of children were trapped in a situation that offered no refuge or protection. Some had lost their parents during the initial bombardments, and others had been partially evacuated, abandoned on the banks of the Volga, or simply forgotten in the confusion of the retreat. Many more, still accompanied by their families, faced daily hunger, cold, and unmediated violence. In this context, the figure of the child soldier emerged not as a planned phenomenon, but as a direct consequence of the collapse of the environment. The Soviet Union, which since the early years of the revolution had promoted youth participation in state tasks through organizations such as the Pioneers and the Komsomol, already had a generation of adolescents who were ideologically trained, disciplined, and committed to the defense of the homeland. When the battle turned urban and Red Army units were forced to defend building by building, these young men began to be integrated, formally or informally, into support roles. At first, they were used as messengers, lookouts, or paramedics. But soon, due to the high mortality rate in the fighting, many of them took up arms and actively participated in combat. One of the best-known cases is that of the 13th Guards Rifle Regiment, which participated in the fighting for the district, Stalingrad Central, starting in September 1942. This legendary regiment, which many exaggeratedly remember as the battalion that held Stalingrad, entered the city with 10,000 soldiers, and by the end of the battle it had fewer than 300. As they lost men, the officers of the 13th Regiment began recruiting the city's teenagers. Many teenagers, some as young as 14 or 15, who had been recruited improvised, voluntarily, or out of urgent need, joined their ranks. Documents from the Soviet Ministry of Defense archives mention young people like Valentin Kotik, who participated in sabotage missions at just 14 years old, or Misha Panikaka, a young recruit of barely 17 years old who became a symbol of resistance after setting himself on fire with an incendiary bottle to stop a German tank. Although their stories were later used for propaganda purposes, their participation was real and their sacrifice authentic. The children of the 13th Regiment were not isolated cases. In various units, both in the army and in the people's militias, there were records of miners fighting as snipers, ammunition loaders, or riflemen. Many did not know how to shoot properly, nor did they have the strength to withstand the recoil of a Mosin Nagant rifle. But their commanders knew they could not spare any available hands. Combat conditions offered no respite. The clashes took place at close range in dark corridors, broken stairwells, and flooded basements. Children were sent to explore ruined areas, plant explosives in enemy-occupied structures, or climb the remains of buildings to act as observers. In many cases, their lighter bodies and agility allowed them to move through spaces inaccessible to adults. Most of these children did not survive. Many died in combat, others from hunger or disease. Those who survived suffered physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Once the war ended, the USSR honored some of them as heroes of the Soviet Union, but others fell into obscurity. Soviet units, during the harshest months of the siege, enjoyed iron discipline, but also a constant need for replacements. In the brigades most battered by the fighting, the integration of miners became a desperate recourse. Although there was no official policy promoting the recruitment of children, the Soviet state never prohibited or prevented their participation when it responded to a patriotic impulse. For propaganda, the figure of the child with a rifle symbolized the purity of the cause, the innocents sacrificed in the name of victory. But beyond the posters and slogans, the reality was different. The child soldiers of Stalingrad slept among the rubble, shared minimal rations with adults, and faced the horror with a mixture of determination and fear. Some kept diaries, others sent letters to their mothers, most of which would never be read, either because the mail never arrived or because the women were already dead. In the besieged city, there was no such thing as childhood. There was only resistance. The case of the 13th Regiment is remembered as an example of this collective effort that included civilians and soldiers alike. Its defense of the Central District against the advance of German armored units helped maintain a critical line that prevented the total collapse of the city. The participation of its combatants, including adolescents, was recognized after the war with decorations and honorable mentions. But beyond the medals and preserved names, there remain the thousands of anonymous children who took up arms too early. Children who knew no other life outside of war. Children who, in the ruins of Stalingrad, left childhood behind forever. However, the recruitment of children and adolescents was not the main reason why the 13th Regiment went down in history, but because its last combatants were part of one of the most important stories of resistance from the Battle of Stalingrad, an episode known as Pavlov's House. Pavlov's House, the fortress of awakened men, the bastion for recapturing Stalingrad. In the heart of Stalingrad, at a strategic intersection across from January 9th Square, stood a four-story apartment building. Built in the 1930s as part of Soviet urban development plans, it was one of many, but during the harshest months of the siege, this building became a legend. What history will remember as Pavlov's House remained for 58 days an impregnable bastion in the midst of hell. It all began in late September 1942, when a reconnaissance platoon from the 7th Platoon of the 42nd Division of the 13th Guards Rifle Regiment, commanded by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, was ordered to take up positions in the building, which had been occupied by German troops. Accompanied by a small group of soldiers, Pavlov organized a rapid assault and managed to dislodge the enemy from the site. Shortly thereafter, reinforcements arrived and preparations for defense began. What followed was a fierce and protracted resistance. The building, situated on a high vantage point, offered a direct view of the Volga River and a key tactical control over one of the city's main avenues. The Wehrmacht attempted repeatedly to take it using infantry, heavy artillery, and armored units, but each attempt was stubbornly repelled. The defending detachment, composed of some 30 Soviet soldiers, turned the building into a fortress. The windows were boarded up with sandbags. The interior walls were perforated to allow passage between rooms without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Machine guns were installed on multiple levels and mines were laid at the main entrances. Operational command was assumed by Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, although the building would later be named in honor of Pavlov for his initial and symbolic role. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, would ironically declare that the Germans lost more men taking Pavlov's house than in the conquest of Paris. The defenders held out for nearly 2 months, from late September to late November, isolated, under constant fire, unable to abandon their position or receive regular supplies. At night, small groups crossed the devastated streets under fire to bring water or ammunition from the Soviet lines. The conditions inside the building were inhuman: lack of heating, extreme cold, constant hunger, and the constant threat of structural collapse under the bombardment. The group managed to survive thanks to discipline, advanced preparation, and ironclad organization. Guard shifts were maintained around the clock. No one slept soundly. Those who did so with a rifle between their legs. They were the awake men, a unit where vigilance was more important than rest and where life itself depended on never lowering their guard. Pavlov's house held out throughout the critical phase of the siege. Its defense had not only symbolic but also strategic value. Thanks to this emblematic bastion, German control over the center of Stalingrad remained incomplete, allowing Soviet forces to maintain a corridor to the Volga. Furthermore, its position hampered the advance of enemy tanks, which were forced to maneuver through clogged streets under constant fire from snipers and light artillery. Following the Soviet counteroffensive launched on November 19, 1942, which encircled the German Sixth Army in Operation Uranus, the pressure on the building eased. Finally, at the end of that month, the siege around Pavlov's house was lifted, and the survivors were relieved. Of the more than 30 original defenders, some died during the defense. Those who survived were decorated. Yakov Pavlov was named a hero of the Soviet Union, and his name was forever associated with that act of extreme resistance. After the war, the building was rebuilt and converted into a monument. Today, in the city renamed Volgograd, an inscription on its facade commemorates those who resisted there, not only as soldiers, but as symbols of the collective will of a people who refused to surrender. Pavlov's house represents the soul of the resistance in Stalingrad, a simple structure made of brick and concrete, transformed by human necessity and determination into an indestructible fortress. It wasn't technology or strategy that saved that position. It was the desperate resistance of a few men and women who chose not to give up even a meter, not a floor, not a window. A shot in the dark, the most dangerous men in Stalingrad, the Soviet snipers. And speaking of windows, these openings often meant instant death for those who poked their heads out or ran among the city's ruins. Because in the darkness, lurking, there were predators hunting the Germans like cats hunted rats moving through the city. We're talking about Soviet snipers, men and women capable of landing a precise shot even in the most tense moments. During the harsh winter of 1942, in the broken heart of a ruined city, a relentless battle raged. Stalingrad, devoured by fire and bombs, was no longer a city. It was a killing field, a prison of frozen rubble and charred walls where every corner could mean the end. In this landscape of despair, where man fused with stone to survive, Soviet snipers emerged as lethal shadows, invisible and patient, hidden guardians of a besieged city. While the armies clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat, they waged a silent war with stares and bated breaths, where a single shot decided the fate. They weren't privileged soldiers nor elite combatants, and in most cases they didn't even have access to weapons in good condition or contemporary for their time. Many used bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifles with antiquated optics, weapons that had been passed down from hand to hand and could barely maintain accuracy amidst the rust and cold. Their uniforms were frozen rags, their hands raw from the icy Volga wind. Their food was scarce and their sleep a dangerous luxury. In the midst of a city that no longer breathed, every broken roof, every gap in a collapsed wall could harbor the trained gaze of a Soviet sniper, waiting with the patience of an ancient predator. His claws might have been a little dull, but his animal instinct was relentless. What made these men and women fearsome was not just their marksmanship, but their sheer resolve. They shot not out of instinct, but out of calculation. They killed not out of fury, but out of necessity. Their task wasn't just to eliminate enemies. It was to sow fear, to disrupt the machinery of the German siege, to slowly undermine enemy morale. They knew that every shot had to count. A mistake could betray their position and result in their immediate death. That's why they camouflaged themselves among the frozen corpses, hid under planks and bricks, breathing earth and gunpowder. They remained motionless for hours, even days, waiting for the enemy to make the slightest mistake. And when they did, they pulled the trigger with almost ritualistic precision, as if each shot were a divine sentence pronounced by the city itself. Among them, one became a legend, Vasily Zaitsev. Hailing from the Urals and accustomed to hunting since childhood, Zaitsev understood the language of stealth and patience. In Stalingrad, where the rules of conventional warfare crumbled along with the buildings, he perfected the art of human hunting. He is credited with more than 200 confirmed kills, although it is suspected that there were many more. But his legacy does not stop at his numbers. Zaitsev was a mentor, teacher, and symbol. He founded a sniper school among the ruins, where he instructed other soldiers in the art of camouflage, observation, and self-control. He trained disciples in the midst of hell, teaching them not only to survive, but to resist with surgical precision. His most famous story, though shrouded in the mists of propaganda and myth, tells of a deadly duel with an elite German sniper supposedly sent to eliminate him. For days, the two hunted each other amid the city's ruins, two phantoms measuring their cunning and mettle. Finally, according to Soviet accounts, Zaitsev prevailed, trapping his adversary in a death trap after endless hours of stalking. True or not, the story became legend, a tale that ignited the fighting spirit of exhausted soldiers and which still resonates today as a symbol of dogged resilience against a superior enemy. But Zaitsev wasn't alone. Hundreds of Soviet snipers, many of them young peasants and hunters turned soldiers, left their mark on the smoking ruins of Stalingrad. Surprisingly, a large proportion of these lethal marksmen were women. More than 2,000 female snipers served in the Red Army during the war, many of whom fought at Stalingrad. Gifted with patience, precision, and a ferocious temper, they proved that gender had no place in a war where the only thing that mattered was the will to resist. Their marksmanship became legendary among their enemies, and their presence challenged both the invader and the prejudices of an era. The conditions were inhumane. There was often no food or water, ammunition was rationed and insufficient, and bandages were scarce. They slept in flooded basements, in sewers among frozen corpses. They suffered from disease, frostbite, or hunger. And yet they remained there, rifles on their shoulders, eye to eye, waiting. They knew their role was not only military but symbolic. In a city that seemed doomed to disappear under the Nazi boot, they were the invisible line that still said, "Here we resist." German soldiers soon began to fear open streets and darkened windows. They knew that any movement could attract a Soviet bullet. Walking through Stalingrad became like Russian roulette. The psychological warfare initiated by the snipers was devastating. They forced the enemy to advance slowly, to use resources and time to detect and neutralize threats that often had already changed positions. In a war of attrition, time was a weapon, and the Soviet snipers knew how to use it. Today, in history books, their names sometimes appear in small print. But among the ruins of Stalingrad, their legacy remains written in the cracks in the walls, in the bullet holes that still mark the facades. They were the eyes that never closed, the shot that altered the course of the battle, the silent voice of a city that refused to die. Amid the deafening roar of artillery and the screams of the dying, they offered a different form of fighting, precise, silent, lethal. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad wasn't just a tactical feat or a matter of numbers. It was also the result of a resistance embodied by individuals who, from the shadows, decided not to give up. The snipers were the hidden edge of that resistance, invisible but essential. Amid the smoke, blood and cold, they stood firm, finger on the trigger, their gaze steady, and thanks to them, history took a different course. Counteroffensive, the Germans are besieged by the Soviet resistance. When winter descended with all its weight on Stalingrad, it wasn't just snow that covered the men of the German Sixth Army. It was the silence of condemnation. In November 1942, with the start of Operation Uranus, the Red Army closed its grip. In a matter of days, more than 250,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped in a white hell with no way out. What had once been a triumphant offensive turned into a mass grave. The German soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning, began to understand that fate had no intention of bringing them home. Food supplies, already scarce before the encirclement, quickly disappeared. The High Command's promise of an airlift, an illusion fueled by orders issued from a distance, turned out to be a cruel joke. The planes carried only a fraction of what was needed. Meanwhile, hunger gripped the men. At first they rationed stale bread and the last of the frost-corroded canned goods, many of them in poor condition. Then they boiled boot leather, chewed paper, and consumed soup made of wire and muddy water. Some ate rats. Others stared with empty eyes at the frozen carcasses of horses, fighting over the hardened pieces of muscle that had not yet rotted. Hygiene became a distant memory. The German positions were blackened, damp, stinking holes dug out of the snow and reinforced with ruins and bodies. The men hadn't washed for weeks. Their uniforms were stiff rags, infested with lice that multiplied like shadows under their clothes. Wounds festered without treatment. Bandages were reused, stained with dried blood and pus. The stench of decay permeated the air. In every corner, death loomed, in the dull gaze of a comrade who no longer responded, in the muffled groan of an abandoned wounded man, in feet blackened by gangrene. The cold was a crueler enemy than the Soviets. The thermometer dropped to -40 degrees. Weapons froze, lubricants solidified, fingers broke while trying to load a rifle. Soldiers died in their sleep, wrapped in blankets that no longer provided warmth. They stood frozen, motionless, like ice statues, their eyes open as if awaiting orders that would never come. Their breath came out like steam from a broken engine, but their hearts gradually slowed until they couldn't breathe anymore. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and pneumonia spread unchecked. The makeshift hospitals were wards of agony, where doctors, lacking supplies, could barely see. The morphine soon ran out. The screams of the amputees were constant until they died away from lack of strength. Many soldiers begged their comrades to shoot them. Some obeyed. Others walked away without responding, simply walking because they could bear no more death. Morale collapsed. The Sixth Army radio continued to broadcast empty phrases, assuring them that help was on the way, that the men must resist. But the soldiers knew they were alone. They looked at the sky, waiting for planes that never arrived. Messages from the High Command were received with a mixture of bitter laughter and resignation. "The Führer does not authorize the retreat," they said. Helplessness was evident in the officers' eyes. Abandonment was evident on the soldiers' faces. Suicide became a common outcome. Officers and soldiers blew their brains out in semi-buried shelters, leaving behind undelivered letters written in shaky pencils. Some prayed, others simply remained silent. Faith, duty, honor, words that dissolved in the thick air of the bunkers like the smoke from a half-smoked cigar. The letters they wrote to their families were white lies. They said things like, "I'm fine. It's cold, but I'm holding on. I'll be back soon." But on the back, on separate sheets of paper they never sent, they wrote their last wishes, the name of a starving friend, the trace of a frozen tear. And meanwhile, the Soviets closed in. Every attempt to break the blockade was repelled with devastating fire. Every attempt to escape was punished with death. The German lines narrowed until there was no more room to flee, no more time to dream of salvation. All that remained was to wait. Wait for the bullet, the explosion, the collapse of the body. Wait for the end. When the Sixth Army finally capitulated in February 1943, it was no longer soldiers emerging from the ruins. They were spectres, shuffling among piles of blackened bodies, their eyes hollow, their faces sunken in, their ribs marked like bars beneath their skin. Of the more than 250,000 men who had been encircled, barely a fraction would return alive years later from Soviet prisoner of war camps. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was the frozen tomb of the myth of German invincibility. And in that grave, the soldiers of the Sixth Army left more than their lives. They left their hopes, their humanity, their memory. They died surrounded by snow, decay, and silence. Not for lack of courage, but for the brutal certainty that there was nothing left to fight for. And the harshness of this conflict reached its boiling point, ironically, in a place the Germans nicknamed the Cauldron. The Kessel, the cauldron where the end of Operation Barbarossa was cooked. On the vast frozen plains of southern Russia, where the wind slashed skin and snow buried dreams, one of the most harrowing tragedies of World War II unfolded. There, in the ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was trapped in a deadly encirclement that the soldiers themselves called der Kessel, or the Cauldron. A name that evoked scorching heat, but in reality represented the relentless cold, insatiable hunger, and ever-present death, in the words of the Germans, "We're cooked in here." It all began in November 1942 when the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a counteroffensive that engulfed the German forces in a lethal embrace. Within days, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers, including Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, were encircled in an area devastated by fighting. Supply lines were cut and hope for an orderly withdrawal faded. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, requested permission to break the encirclement and withdraw. But from Berlin, Adolf Hitler ordered resistance at all costs. The city must be held not for its strategic value, but for the symbolism it represented. Thus, the soldiers trapped in the cauldron became pawns in a suicidal obstinacy. The airlift promised by Hermann Göring turned out to be an illusion. At least 700 tons of provisions were needed daily to sustain the Sixth Army, but in practice barely 100 arrived. Blizzards, Soviet air dominance, and a lack of suitable aircraft rendered the airlift insufficient. Soldiers began to starve, consuming minimal rations and resorting to horse meat whenever possible. The cold became a more vicious enemy than the Red Army itself. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, freezing weapons and bodies alike. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, and many chose to self-harm in order to be evacuated, although more often than not, the seriously wounded were left behind with no hope of rescue. Diseases spread unchecked. Dysentery, typhus, and other infectious diseases decimated the troops. Makeshift hospitals were places of agony where doctors, short of supplies and medicine, could barely offer comfort. The stench of decay permeated the air, and death became a constant and inescapable presence. Meanwhile, attempts to break the encirclement from the outside failed. Operation Winter Storm, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, failed to reach the encircled forces. Soviet troops resisted fiercely, and the distance between the rescuers and the besieged, though short in kilometers, became an impassable chasm. Inside the cauldron, morale collapsed. Letters to families were white lies, masking despair and suffering. Some soldiers committed suicide, unable to bear the anguish. Others simply surrendered to fate, waiting for the bullet that would end their misery. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a promotion that carried with it the implicit order not to surrender. No German marshal had ever been captured alive, and Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. But on January 31st, Paulus surrendered to the Red Army, disobeying his Führer's order and becoming the first German marshal to be captured alive. The surrender did not end the suffering. The captured soldiers were forced to march through the snow in what became known as the Death March. In extreme temperatures and without food or shelter, tens of thousands died along the way. The survivors were sent to prisoner-of-war camps where conditions were equally inhumane. Of the more than 90,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 returned to Germany years later. The Stalingrad Kessel tragedy was a turning point in the war. The defeat of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of the decline of the Third Reich and demonstrated the limits of the Nazi war machine. But beyond its strategic implications, the Kessel was a human catastrophe, a reminder of the brutality of war and the incalculable price of blind obedience. In the ruins of Stalingrad, amid the rubble and corpses, the myth of German invincibility crumbled. The Kessel became a symbol of Soviet resilience and the madness of a war that consumed millions of lives. And in the memory of humanity, the Kessel remains a grim testament to what happens when unbridled ambition and indifference to human life trump reason and compassion. What bleeds is the dome, the fate of the generals who surrendered at Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, trapped in Stalingrad, was not just a collection of soldiers doomed by hunger and cold. It was also the final stage of an internal drama among generals who faced not only the external enemy, but also their own consciences, blind loyalty, and the crushing weight of impossible decisions. At the top of that collapsed structure was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous man with an orderly mind, more a map-making strategist than a field commander. He was a disciplined officer, trained in the logic of the Prussian general staff who blindly trusted the hierarchy and the orders from Berlin. But at Stalingrad, that structure became a moral prison. When the Soviet encirclement closed in November 1942, Paulus had the opportunity to order a retreat westward to break the siege while there was still time, still fuel, still life. His most experienced subordinates recommended flight, as moving was the only hope. But from Rastenburg, at his headquarters, Adolf Hitler ordered the opposite: to resist, not to yield an inch, and to die if necessary. For Hitler, Stalingrad was not a battle. It was a symbol, and symbols are not abandoned, even if they cost hundreds of thousands of lives. However, Paulus was there, watching his men die of hunger and cold, seeing the blood boiling in the cauldron, and he could not be as cold-hearted as the Führer. Nevertheless, he remained faithful to the principle of duty and chose obedience. At his side was General Arthur Schmidt, his chief of staff, a loyal but hardened officer with an unyielding character who reinforced his commander's every decision with a coolness that contrasted with the growing desperation among the soldiers. Schmidt was, in many ways, more Hitlerian than Paulus himself. Where the marshal hesitated, Schmidt imposed firmness. As the men froze to death, Schmidt discussed impossible counterattack plans based on divisions that no longer existed, waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive. His conviction in German superiority blinded him to the obvious, that they were surrounded, weakened, and that every day lost brought the Sixth Army closer to total annihilation. But not all generals were willing to walk silently to their deaths. One of them was General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 13th Army Corps. The son of a noble family, trained in the Prussian tradition, Seydlitz represented what remained of principled officer corps. Faced with the complete collapse of the front, he proposed the unthinkable, severing communications with Berlin and authorizing his subordinates to surrender if circumstances so required. For him, the preservation of human life was not cowardice, it was responsibility. He held a deep conviction that a good commander had a duty to avoid pointless sacrifices. But the rest of the chain of command did not share his vision and received these proposals with coldness and indignation. No one wanted to be seen as weak or a traitor in Hitler's eyes. He was accused of disloyalty, his troops were left without support, and his relationship with Paulus was forever fractured. In January 1943, when food and ammunition were running out and soldiers were turning their uniforms into bandages, Hitler gave one final order. Friedrich Paulus would be promoted to Field Marshal. In reality, it wasn't a decoration but a poisoned gesture. Never before had a German marshal been captured alive, so the message was clear. Paulus must die before being taken prisoner. It was a sentence disguised as honor. But Paulus, in that final moment, didn't obey. On January 31st, when the Soviets stormed his command bunker in the basement of the Univermag store in the center of the destroyed city, Paulus surrendered. He surrendered without resistance, without speeches, without glory. Silent, trembling, with the blank stare of someone who has seen everything he once held firm crumble. For some, it was cowardice. For others, a belated spark of reason. Arthur Schmidt was also captured alongside him, still convinced it was all a mistake, still rejecting the inevitable. His surrender was less dignified, aggressive, defensive, like a man unable to accept that the world he knew had ended. Unlike Paulus, who remained silent for weeks, Schmidt shouted at his captors, demanding official treatment, as if he still had authority over something more than his own shadow. Seydlitz, on the other hand, had been captured shortly before, and when he realized that Germany would not rescue his men nor accept responsibility for their tragedy, he made an even more radical decision. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization of German prisoners created by the Soviets with the aim of undermining the Nazi regime. From there, he called for the surrender of German troops and insubordination against Hitler. His message was clear. Blind obedience had led to disaster. It was time to think for themselves. Many called him a traitor. Others saw in him a man who refused to be complicit in absolute destruction. After the war, the paths of these three men followed divergent and tragic paths. Paulus remained a prisoner in the Soviet Union for more than a decade. Over time, he also collaborated with the Soviet authorities, testified at Nuremberg against his former comrades, and lived out his final years in East Germany, marked by guilt, exiled from his original homeland, forgotten by those who had once glorified him. He died in 1957 in someone else's bed, with more questions than answers. Arthur Schmidt, also freed by the Soviets, lived out the rest of his days in West Germany, in stony silence, refusing any self-criticism, locked in a version of events where the defeat was never his responsibility. He died in 1987, clinging to a past that no longer wanted to hear his name. Seydlitz, released in 1955, returned to a divided Germany that knew neither how to forgive nor understand him. He was declared a traitor by the West German state, expelled from the army and stripped of all honor. He died in 1976 without recognition but also without repentance. Stalingrad not only broke armies, it tore apart the souls of those who held the power to decide. In the icy stillness of that broken city, amid frost-covered corpses and walls riddled with artillery fire, the illusion that absolute obedience is a virtue also collapsed. There, the German High Command, trained to win battles on paper, discovered that in the realm of humanity there are no infallible manuals, that true command demands judgment, and that sometimes, to preserve honor, one must have the courage to disobey.